Dear colleagues, before we start, first of all, thank you so much for providing this opportunity to talk about my research. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Narendurani, who talked to me about the project, the Peer Network, Political Economy of Education Research Network, and invited me to participate in this series of seminars. I'm also very grateful to Dr. Asel Sharimova, who was extremely patient with me during the whole process of preparation of this event tonight. I wrote and defended my dissertation on evolving notions of childhood several years ago. My journey with this particular topic started with my family, and while I was writing about this while I was writing this thesis, I was looking at the history of my family through the time. I was born in the Soviet Union, and this country experienced a set of transformations, and particularly in the 90s, there were a lot of transformation that concerned both politics and economics while I was in the mid-school. During one of the conversations I had with my mother, I stressed that my childhood was very similar to the childhoods of two previous generations. My grandmother and myself went to the same school. My mother and I had experiences of Soviet summer camps, pioneer summer camps. I had similar extracurricular activities as my mother and my grandmother. My mother and I read the same books while we were growing up, played the same games with other children in the yard. All of us had experience of the communist system of children and youth organizations. We were Octobrists, we were pioneers. I didn't make it to Komsomol because the country has collapsed in December 91, and that was the only reason I couldn't actually join this youth organization. I was growing up with the notion that childhood is a happy period of life. And when I went to Cambridge, I was asking myself why it has to be happy. In a way, this shared experience of growing up in the Soviet Union and experience of happy childhoods were the starting points of my research. The other inspiration for this research was connected to London. You see on the slide a picture of the powerless structure figure 101, and it is a sculpture of a boy on a rocking horse. I have seen it on the Trafalgar Square in 2012, and here a child is elevated to the status of historical hero. Though there is no history to commemorate, only a future to hope for. The authors of this composition, Michael Elmgreen and Ingar Draxet, state that we wanted to create a public sculpture which, rather than dealing with topics of victory or defeat, honors the everyday battles of growing up. The artists were celebrating a young, fearless boy. And for me, this monument was a visual oxymoron because the artists put a child on a monument, but at the same time, they called the idea powerless. So in a way, these two ideas of shared childhood experiences for generations of children who grew up in the Soviet Union and were supposed to be happy, along with a notion of childhood that is celebrated but was often framed as something vulnerable, provided an inspiration for me while I was doing my research. Today, we'll talk about one of the aspects of my dissertation. I will discuss evolution of Soviet construct of childhood, and I will talk about schooling as a necessary component of Soviet childhood. I feel often that histories of children and young people are still under-researched area in the post-Soviet space. In Kazakhstan, children constitute a third of population. In Russia and the western part of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the share is slightly smaller. Children and young people represents a meaningful category because as a category, they are institutionalized and they were promoted by the system, Soviet system on various levels. The introduction of obligatory schooling increased the time that young people spend outside the house, the home, their family, and particularly this applies to children in urban areas. Large numbers of children school and university age boys and girls joined communist youth organizations like myself, and through compulsory education and youth organizations, the Soviet system created a special category again that remained even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I hope I'll address some of these aspects today. So I'll start with the revolution of 1917, because with the establishment of the Soviet rule on the territory of the Russian Empire, and the current territory of Kazakhstan was included was part of the Russian Empire. With the establishment of the Soviet rule, the Institute of Family experienced a deep transformation. Almost immediately after the Bolsheviks came into power, certain traditions, for example, on the territory of Kazakhstan, including polygamy, compulsory marriage, levirate, and bride buying, all these traditions were abandoned. Certain holidays and celebrations, including all religious holidays, has been forgotten. The Institute of the Family has been challenged.
Забытый институт семьи тоже оказался под...
Alexander Kollontai, who later on became the first Soviet ambassador to France, promised that the Soviet state would lift the burdens of motherhood from women's shoulders and transfer them to the state. So Soviet theorists differed on what role parents would play in children's upbringing with women's liberation, but they all agreed that the state would render substantial help and the family would disappear eventually. It was believed that the transformation and the gradual disappearance of the family would contribute to raising of a new Soviet individual. Soviet political leaders saw a child as a blank slate. Therefore, the value of a child for the state was connected to a young person being the perfect material that could be forged into a new citizen. The Soviet educational leadership believed that childish behavior should be discouraged while responsibility and adulthood were acclaimed. According to the new thinking, children were expected to grow up faster, to join adults and help adults in the creation of a new just society. The party called attention to the importance of the Soviet struggle and creation of a new hero for its people, the new Soviet man. And writers were expected to create characters who would rouse the people to feats of labor, combat their moods of apathy or self-complacency, improve discipline and morale, and increase interest in communal warfare. So some of these writers appealed to children directly. On this slide, you see two excerpts from the poems by Vladimir Miakovsky, the poet of the revolution. The first one is from 1927. The second one was written much later, right before his death in 1930. This idea of fast-tracked growing up is very well summarized here. The poet says, we're moving ahead in building the communist society. Teenagers stop being a child, become a fighter and an activist. The lyrics meant that growing up was to contribute to the development of this new society, explained by eventual transformation of the child into adult. His lyrics, we should be able to take aims, to be able to shoot, we will be providing help in every battle. They were implied, they were directed at the representatives of younger generation and demonstrated a very different idea of a child as a younger partner who should be helping in changing the world. These ideas of independent, assertive, proactive children was not new. It has history and certain similarities with other utopic projects that practiced in Protestant communities or kibbutz. And by kibbutz, I mean kibbutz implies communal settlements in Palestine that have started at the end of the 19th century. And in these communities, both in Protestant communities and kibbutz communities in Israel, these practices of raising independent children were directed at providing professional training to children. Children were often separated from the family, and basically there was an attempt to raise a new type of individual. And kibbutzniks, some of the Soviet educators, believed that the role of the family was almost irrelevant. Some institutions were much more, capable of providing necessary upbringing for children. The Kibbutz Experiment, in particular, was specifically directed at separating children from us, and it's very well summarized in one of the books of Bruno Becas's, The Attitude of Kibbutzniks toward children who were treated like adults right from the moment of their birth. Of independent child communities are separated in communities for besprizorniki. After 6 years of civil war, revolution, red terror, evacuation, famines, epidemics, millions of families across the former Russian Empire have been separated. Children who were abandoned formed groups, and they were traveling together in these groups across the country, sometimes stealing and begging. The new Soviet power establishes centers to take these children from the streets and then transfer them to orphanages. In 1926 and 1928, there were 2 direct campaigns to remove children from the streets, and both were quite unsuccessful. And in the 30s, according to some estimates, obviously it's very difficult to find a good estimate, the number of these children across the country reaches about 2 million. So in 1928, the state of homelessness becomes a crime. And Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the head of the Soviet Special Forces, starts a war against these children, finding them in trains and on the train stations and on the roads. One of the solutions was to send these children to labor communes and child colonies, and Soviet educators believed that labor would allow to change and re-educate these children. So there are a lot of communes like Bolshev labor commune are created across the country that provide shelter to thousands of these children who, while they live in the commune, at the same time work across several factories. This is one of the small projects. Well, it was a mess if you think about the country, but it's one of the many projects that starts in the 1930s. And by this time, by the beginning of the 1930s, we can see at least 3 different components specific to the Soviet model of childhood, or the Soviet construct of childhood. And this model includes the universal education, involvement of state institutions, and very strong ideological component. Receiving education became a new obligation of the child. By acquiring literacy and relevant skills, children helped the state. Before the revolution, children helped the family and the family economy by supporting it. So why education has been perceived as an important instrument for building new citizens? Developing mass literacy was so crucial to the success of the revolution because, according to Lenin's argument, as long as there is such thing in the country as illiteracy, it is hard to talk about political education. So basically, this whole population of children had to read and write in order to be politically educated. It is quite difficult to evaluate levels of literacy at the point at the point before the revolution in the Russian Empire. The basic sources on literacy are censuses and criminal statistics. And the first empire-wide data on literacy appeared only in 1897. And if we try to compare the levels with some other countries, during the same period of time, the Russian Empire was much more behind in terms of mass education. And in this table, for example, literacy is understood as the ability to read. The census of 1897 looks at the population of 6 out of 69 provinces, and that obviously does not provide a detailed picture. In 1897, literacy's ability to read among the population age 9 and older was about 35% for males and about 13% for females in the countryside. In the cities, the figures were higher. And obviously, if you look at the literacy among different groups, the highest level of literacy was achieved in the group of nobility and clergy. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the Soviet power increases expenditure on popular education, and these expenditures increase something like tenfold. Free and universal access to education was mandated for all children from the ages of 3 to 16 years old, and the number of schools at least doubled within the first 2 years after the revolution. And this education, the literacy campaigns like this were launched nationally among all categories of population, and they were directed at toddlers, soldiers, adolescents, workers, and peasants. Children were crucial because, according to the Bolsheviks, education had to create a new generation of workers who would be prepared to run society in their own interests. The second target were women, because education was supposed to free women from the housework, and therefore here comes the attempts to provide universal creches and preschools. However, if we think about the conditions of these schools that are newly created across the whole country, the conditions were horrendous. One historian describes the horrible levels of scarcity in the 1920s. There was 1 pencil per 60 pupils, 1 pen per 22 pupils, and 1 notebook for every 2 pupils. And basically in 1921, a literacy cheka, this is like emergency committee of the Soviet power, or the Bolshevik power, they prepare a brochure for short-term literacy courses, and there is a chapter that is included in this brochure entitled "How to Get By Without Paper, Pencils, or Pens." So most of schools were teaching both children and their parents, and if you're curious to read more about teaching in these conditions, I would highly recommend a novel by Maria Prilezhaeva. It is in Russian language and it is called Zelёная ветка Maya, a green branch of May, and it's an autobiographical novel where the author talks about a young girl who is sent to the village to teach children without textbooks, pens or pencils. Overall, I mean, it's a beautiful account of that very challenging period of time. So if we'll talk about the second component of the Soviet childhood, it's an extensive youth group apparatus that was supplementing schooling and was furthering Communist Party influence over children while limiting parental controls. So this concept of children as young adults helped in the creation of all-country pioneer organization. It helped in the creation of Komsomol and Octobrists. So children were embraced as members of the communist youth organizations. They were moving gradually based on their age from one organization to a different one. The ceremonies of accession to every stage reminded religious ceremonies. They were conducted in front of all members of the school. They were attended by parents often, and at the end of the ceremony, children received symbols. These were pins or kerchiefs that indicated their belonging to the group. Some researchers mentioned that majority of Soviet adults remembered the ceremony of induction into young pioneers or Komsomol as one of the happiest, proudest days of their lives. in the perception of young people who were the members of this movement.
Один,
Authority over them,
а,
since the acceptance to the pioneer
и восприятие этих молодых людей, они были членами пионерского движения.
quite an important and very heavy in terms of ideology moment. The ideological component played extremely important role.
Компонент играл действительно очень важную роль в детском образовании. И если вы посмотрите на два режима тоталитарных стран, это нацистская Германия, Советский Союз, их машина пропаганды нацеливалась на детей уже сразу.
Years ago, I was teaching a first-year seminar at Narcos University, and we were discussing propaganda in the totalitarian systems. And my students and I were looking at different posters of the 1930s and the 1940s in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And it was amazing how similar these were. The only difference is the language, while the visuals are pretty much the same. So you have like two examples here on the right. This propaganda was both about the qualities of the young generation. The young generation is very good, I mean, very well behaved, very pure, and obviously the future. Children were pictured as someone not polluted by socialization with old regime, not susceptible to the backwardness of this ignorant, drunk adults. Religion, in the Soviet propaganda, not in the German one, obviously, religion was attacked as harmful superstition. Religion and the church were particularly dangerous because they were associated with ancien regime, oppressing workers and peasants. And the revolutionary hierarchy of values, God, family, service for the society, and personal interest. In the Soviet Union, it has been destroyed, and it was replaced by a different system that valued communal interest, collectivism, and to a certain extent, personal demands. Overall, Soviet education was tasked with providing international, anti-religious, collective upbringing to children. This idea of collective upbringing, it was suggested by Lenin, who promised to turn Soviet Union into a rich country. I mean, if you allow me to quote, he said, "We want to turn Russia, a country of poverty and lawlessness, into a rich country. This can be done only by means of collective common labor," at the end of the quote. It is at once the end and means to communism. Growth of cooperation is identical with the growth of socialism. By producing social instead of private, ownership of the means of production and exchange, by introducing well-regulated organization in the social process of production, we allow to uplift the level of the society, and the social revolution of the proletariat will abolish the division of the society. So basically, the question is how collectivism was taught to children. The emphasis was put on the importance of the social organization, and that's why children were part of the social organization at all stages of their life. And it was also told, I mean, like they were also told about the insignificance of individual point of view. They heard this message starting from the kindergarten and going to the university, and collectivization appealed to them from school books, in newspapers, cinemas, radios, the sports club and theater. The ideology was also in the portraits of the people who were hanging on the walls. It was like in Orwell's 1984, always there were eyes watching you and the voice enveloping you, asleep or awake, indoors or outdoors, in the bath or bed, no escape. So, I mean, here I have two pictures. This is from the 1930s kindergarten room in Germany. This picture is quite, I mean, it was taken later. This is actually a photo of the kindergarten group of my mother. And this is the end of the 1950s, and the same watching eyes from the voice. The idea of the Soviet leader was quite close to the Greek idea of democracy, ruled by this ambitious, strong, very heroic person. And I mean, if you think about the image of Lenin and Stalin, I mean, and how they were called in the official propagandas, our leaders, who even when they died, but their spirit lives. And our father, I mean, like basically Stalin at some point here becomes the father of the nation and the grandfather for all children of the Soviet Union. And I mean, these I mean, like similar mottos were probably not only in the Soviet Union at that time, but also in other totalitarian regimes. So in the era of the rapid industrialization, and in the 20s and the 1930s, Soviet Union lives through the era of the rapid industrialization. Children were often compared to the energy resources. For example, in the collection of critical essays on the role of the Soviet literature for children, the editors state the following: "We are currently experiencing radical alteration of all branches of industry, including human resources. And during this period, the task of preparing builders of socialism has a huge significance." So alteration of the existing materials adults was too labor-intensive process compared to the education of the young people. And this view of children as a resource influenced the high social status of children during the discussed period of time. Soviet literature curriculum was especially significant in this regard. Soviet literature for children required proper illustrations, and it had to help young leaders and young readers to understand that they're surrounded by the reactionary and bourgeois society, and how important it is to overcome these issues. So even some of the contemporary authors who were writing for children, they were not safe from the critique. For example, a very famous child writer, Miakovsky, he was labeled, and his poems were labeled as bourgeois nonsense at some point, because according to his to the people who critiqued him, and that was actually Deputy Minister of Education and wife of Vladimir Lenin, Nadezhda Krupskaya, they were quite dissatisfied with missing Soviet content in the poem. And from their point of view, the new child would not understand what Kornichakovsky poems were about. Basically, the children, I'm sorry, if you mind. So in contrast to Nazi ideologies of the 1930s and 40s, who were borrowing the ideas from German pantheon, the Soviet propaganda had to create these new heroes because they couldn't borrow from the past. Heroes had to be also children, and they were supposed to stand as icons of the revolutionary future. One of the first novels that comes out after the revolution is The Three Fat Men by Yuri Alesha Tritostika. It's one of the first child books written and published after the revolution. So Alesha addressed the struggle with evil forces, and children are put in the center of this conflict. There are two children, capable, independent decision makers, who are struggling with this horrible society and surrounded by these horrible adults. This book was heavily criticized, but the idea of introducing new child heroes lived. The image of self-assertive, politically aware, intellectually autonomous child is also found in the works of Arkady Gaidar. Gaidar wrote this tale about military secret in the aftermath of the 1919 Civil War. So there is an older brother for the protagonist who's basically shown on the slide, and the name of the protagonist is Machishki Balchish. And basically this boy is left by himself because his father and his grandfather and his brother all left to save the revolution. So basically the young boy is left by himself to save the world and to help the surviving members of the community. And I mean, in his appeal to help the Red Army, the little boy says, "Hey, little kids, should we only play with sticks and jump ropes? Our fathers are gone and our brothers are gone. Should we wait for these evil people to come and take us to their cursed country?" So the story of this boy is a story of betrayal and loss of the young life, because at the end of the story, this young hero dies. He dies for the country, he dies for the revolution, and even the enemy admires the sacrifice of this young boy willing to protect the ideas of the new society. So in this story, Arkady Gaidar stresses the idea of child's autonomy. In this story, basically the children who are the readers learn about collectivist norms, about the values, importance in their role to shape the world of adults, the Soviet utopia. There is a quite important story that also appears in the 1930s, and it is about Pablo Maroza, who is a devout pioneer who has denounced his father only to be murdered by his grandfather. And he's an example of successful construction of a young Soviet martyr. Basically, before that, when we talked about Alesha's novel and the small fairy tale written by Gaidar, I mean, these are all made up heroes. Here we have a real person or a hero who has a real protagonist. So Pablo Maroza, he becomes a hero pioneer of the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, his image is immortalized in the poems, in the monuments, in the movies, and even one opera. Basically, the Soviet education embraces the image of Pablo Maroza, and there are all like real life replicas of Pablo Maroza and all over the Soviet Union. For example, you know, it has such an impact that in 1939, there is a 13-year-old girl who becomes suspicious of her father's involvement with a conspirators organization. And then in her diary, she writes, if she should, you know, report the father to NKVD, the secret police, and she writes, I would have to do this because this was a sacrifice for the Soviet state, because this has the greatest thing I could do for my ideas. This example, in a way, illustrates the Soviet state was perceived as a much closer kin compared to their own family. It's quite interesting that the whole legend of Pablo Maroza, it evolves during the history of the Soviet Union. Catriona, and it's absolutely beautiful book. In the earlier legend, in the earlier versions of the legend of Pablo Maroza, he acts independently when denouncing his parents. In the later versions, he becomes less independent and he receives help from adults. And this happens actually because the idea of an independent child has clashed with the personality cult of Joseph Stalin. So this conflict required a shift in the Soviet perception of a child and childhood. So over the next decade, Stalin brought a halt to all programs aimed at revolutionizing the family, especially in the area of child rearing. The government has introduced new legal and political changes directed at strengthening the family institutions, including abortion ban, divorce restrictions, introduction of a new tax for single persons and childless couples, payments to women with large families. The family, in a way, is brought back. The parental authority also requires prominence during that period of time, and this happens in the mid-1930s. Basically, in their official newspaper, or Komsomolskaya Pravda, it's official newspaper for the youth division of the Communist Party, there are several messages about importance of family, loyalty as a component of communist morality. According to this newspaper, parents deserve respect, as elders who helped us to be happy, as people who raised us. So if we think about the earlier version of these parents who are backward, who are religious, and who are dragging children into this past, here we have elders who are helped to raise us. So the family kind of, I mean, it's rehabilitated during this period of time. Excuse me. And it's quite interesting to observe this in the literature for children, because it also experiences a transformation. The iconoclastic behavior against adults is no longer on agenda. And for example, at the conference on children's literature in 1936, one of the founding fathers of the Soviet children's stories, Samuel Marshak, talks about the importance of children's stories for children. And he talks about the importance of new books, where it talks about happy children, about their families, their everyday life. So the family is brought back. Marshak call for the creation of the proper stories for children is a reflection of 1935 Stalin's famous declaration at the first Congress of Stakhanovitz: life has become better, comrades, life has become happier. This speech created a watershed between the image of an active child in the literature, in the press, and a child who is part of the family, a child who is born under the happy Soviet star, who is obedient, who is obviously important, still important to the state, but is definitely less active. This moment is the moment when the idea of happy childhood is born. It didn't appear overnight, obviously, and it was actually, born much earlier, even in the classic Russian literature. I mean, it was brought up by Tolstoy's childhood, his детство, and there is a wonderful and beautiful passage about the own good fortune of narrator who talks about his important childhood. His happy childhood, but this real heyday of happy childhood, and then comes in the mid-1930s. And the year of 1934 and 1935, they witnessed this upsurge of joy and happiness articles in the press, where you can see titles like "The Happy Life" or "The Children in the Land of Bolsheviks," where the children of a happy country, there is no end to the joy. The legend of this happy childhood culminates in the wonderful movie by Alexandrov, The Circus. The main heroine is played by fabulous Lyubov Orlova, and who plays an American performer. And she is ostracized by her countrymen for raising a mixed-race son. And during the grand finale of the film, a small child of Orlova, he's passed from hand to hand among Soviet spectators. This scene is full of symbolism, because each spectator at the circus represents a different ethnic group that lives on the territory of the Soviet Union, and every spectator who holds the child for several minutes, they're singing a lullaby to the sleeping boy in their own language. So we hear the lullaby sang in Russian, then Ukrainian, then English, then Kyrgyz, then Georgian, Yiddish, and again in Russian. And this is supposed to demonstrate acceptance and tolerance to children, but I mean the way the child is shown in this film is a vulnerable child, or is a child that needs belonging. Then after this beautiful scene of the lullaby, it is followed by the song "Wide is My Motherland," that became a second unofficial alternative Soviet anthem. And you can see the lyrics on the slide there in Russian, but the lyrics say, I know of no other country where a man can breathe so free. And the film itself serves as a statement for two main ideas. First, any child, despite his or her country of origin or background or the color of the skin, will be accepted and embraced by the Soviet state and society. in comparison to the racist Western society, because this child, the child of Orlova, has not been accepted, and in a way this is her secret. And the second idea that is also developed in this film, the representation of the child in this film as someone who is extremely vulnerable and fragile. This makes an image of children dependent on goodwill of adults and who are happy to sacrifice everything to provide for the happy childhood. So the idea of less politicized children becomes very prominent during the second half of the 1930s and until the end of Stalin's rule in the 1950s. And there is also a demand to change the activities of children. If, for example, in the 1920s and the beginning of the 30s, the children were receiving this political education at schools and they had all these long sessions of political education, even in the elementary school. During the 1930s, there is a new appeal. There is a demand for summer camps. The children have to spend more time outside in the nature. They have to play games. The political education hardly ended, but it has definitely decreased in importance. In order to bring more joy into children's life, the Communist Party also reinstates old pre-revolutionary holidays. If you remember, the New Year has been abandoned. The celebration of Christmas has been forbidden because it was a religious holiday. However, on 1st January of 1936, there is a traditional figure of Grandfather Frost, Ded Moroz in Russian. It makes re-entry into the life of children across the Soviet Union, but first event happened in Kharkov. So previously banished toys, dolls, fairy tales, they reappear again in children's life. And during the Soviet Congress, Soviet Writers' Congress, both Maxim Gorky, who is a renowned, very well-known Russian Soviet writer, and Samuel Marshak, who is a child's poet, they mention the importance of, again, creating ideologically desirable fairy tales for children. So the fairy tales, in a way, they can come back. However, there is a particular interesting detail about this period, and both in Soviet art, literature, and official speeches, children are expressing their gratefulness to Stalin, a wise leader offering advice on any aspect of children's life. And I mean, here we see the New Year tree, right, or the Christmas tree behind his back. But I mean, obviously, Stalin reenacts a role of Santa Claus, Ded Moroz. There is a phrase, thank you, dear comrade Stalin, for our happy childhood. It appears everywhere in public spaces. It's pinned on the walls, printed in books and magazines. Stalin, in words of Vyacheslav Molotov, is a teacher, leader, favorite friend to children all over the world. And presence of this great leader in children's life is so confusing that there is a girl remembering her childhood, and she recalls in her diaries, even though I did not love Stalin more than my mama and papa, I loved him very much. And there is another girl in her diaries inquiring from her mother, who should I love more, Stalin or the parents? So it is a bit confusing for children. The image of grateful and happy child can be seen in official scene, but obviously because Soviet government wasn't very interested in showing the idea of the child in difficult situation. According to the official press, unhappy children live abroad, or they all exist in the pre-revolutionary past. And therefore, the Soviet newspapers, they exploit this approach, and they compare the unfortunate experiences of the happy well-being of Soviet children with these unhappy, dreadful conditions of children who lived during the pre-Soviet times or who lived in the Western countries. But there were certain categories of children who had, who experienced obviously poverty and inequality. And this is usually explained by this pollution of children's lives. So we talked a bit about беспризорники, the homeless children, and in the Soviet propaganda, these homeless children are explained by the legacy of the Imperial Russia. So they are supposed to disappear once the socialist society is fully formed. But there are also the children of wealthy peasants. In the 1930s, there is the new wave of deportation of these wealthy peasants, and there are children who are often left behind. Nadezhda Krupskaya, the wife of Lenin, she emotionally writes about children of deported peasants, and she talks that, you know, they shouldn't be responsible for the deeds of their parents, and she presents in her letters the children as someone extremely vulnerable. So as a result, the Politburo, basically the highest body in the communist system, it allows the children of these families, these Kulak families, to reject their families. And so these children could be considered for re-education. However, during the Great Purge, there was this period of great terror in the 1930s. Even young children are sent to labor camps, or they are placed in special institutional settings. According to several estimates, children constituted about 40% of all persons who were affected by repressions, famine, epidemics, and forced migration. And according to other estimates, it's about 10 million children who lost their parents during the repressions. And I mean, like there are a lot of records in Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Evgenia Ginsburg, for example, texts. Basically, the photo on this slide has a very interesting story. It became iconic. There was even a monument based on this photo. It's a story of a girl whose father was, after the picture was taken, was killed in the concentration camp, and her mother has committed the suicide. And so in some cases, as mentioned already, and I talked about the kulaks, the wealthy peasants, in some cases, the Soviet secret police and KVD also tries to destroy children's attachment to their family and their parents, and the education system plays a very, very important role in this, because the schools has played, the schools were, how to say, a place for denunciation. So denunciation is a voluntary reporting of wrongdoing of the parents. It was practiced at schools. It was practiced in front of big crowds and in front of all other children. And there is a wonderful film where there is an episode on the role of the education system in deforming or destroying the family dynamics. So this film is on the slide. It's a novel by Boris Vasilyev, Завтра была война, there was a war tomorrow, and there is a movie based on this novel. So, I mean, there is also a scene where the girl is forced to denounce her own parents and her own father, and I mean she forced in order to commit a suicide. So let me move to the period after Stalin's death, because with the death of the leader and Khrushchev's anti-Stalin speech, the image of Stalin gradually disappears from the public space. So there are other grown-ups who take this space. There is Lenin, there is cosmonauts, there are war heroes, because it's already after the end of the Second World War, and they start playing an increasingly important role in the lives of young members of the Soviet society. The children state, the object of the state upbringing, the state of childhood stayed happy, but obviously I mean, like as it was already mentioned, I mean, the state of childhood has been slightly changing after the revolution of the 1917. The perception of the childhood as a concept has been transferred over time. So it was originally driven by the revolutionary ideas of raising a new human being, a builder of the new society. And the image, there was an image of the child as an equal partner to the grown-ups or small adults. However, it has been transferred into an image of a very fragile, vulnerable being in the 1930s because of the collision with the cult of Joseph Stalin. And therefore, the pure revolutionary child, the pure assertive, active child has been disappeared because the child cannot be better than an adult. During Stalin's years, the Soviet states created a rigid hierarchy within a family with children as very docile and obedient creatures, beings, who are at the bottom of this pyramid, where the Stalin evolved into this fatherly figure taking care of all children in the Soviet country. During this period, the state invented an idea of the Soviet happy childhood. However, it's worth noting that the central idea was the emphasis on childhood happiness as opposed to health, security, adequate education, lived even until the moment when the Soviet state has collapsed in 1991. The emphasis on happiness as the essential state of the Soviet children, it didn't vanish with the disappearance of Stalin. It existed for almost 40 years after his death. This myth became a fixture of official propaganda, and it stayed in the official language and state programs. And even in the post-Soviet countries, when we talk about younger generation, there are often, revitalization of the theme of the happiness in the childhood, revitalization of the theme that young people should be educated and happy. I will finish with this slide. There is some literature that has been used for this research, and basically it's quite difficult to compete with Catriona Kelly and her Children's World Growing Up in Russia. I mean, because I think it's an encyclopedia of Soviet childhood in general, but yeah, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Anel. Thank you for